Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here, and alright, I'll admit it, this little tour of ours has gone wildly off the rails. Considering how many seats were on the tour bus we rode around the old world compared to how many of you are still alive, well, let's just say I'm glad I included the no refund clause. In any event, besides the few commenters we lost to the pursuing Skaven during the breakout, I'm pleased that we managed to run into allies. It was a tad alarming when all those tomb scorpions and sepulchral stalkers burst out of the ground to defend the borders of Khemri. With all the Skaven slaughtered and our construct guides leading us to the safety of the Nehekhara capital, it seems like the time for another tale. What? Why am I allies with the Tomb Kings of Khemri? Well, if you must know, apparently, I take so long between lore videos that the Lich Priest managed to get a copy of my Cetra the Imperishable lore video script and read it to the King of Kings. Luckily, he actually enjoyed it, and so we should be safe for now. Anyway, despite all this wretched sand and blazing heat, I'm still happy to regale you with the stories of two individuals who might best represent the Tomb Kings as heroes of legend. One, a great paragon of Nehekharan values, and the other, a soul forever cursed. The first hero I wish to tell you about begins with a secret. As uniquely among the famous heroes of the Tomb Kings, he is the only one who was not born in the holy land of Nehekhara. It was even whispered by those around him that his parents were from a land far to the north, and thus he faced no small amount of discrimination and loneliness, as his fellows considered him little more than an uncouth barbarian. Nekaf he was named, and is one you may have heard of before, if you're familiar with the tale of Cetra that I've told in recent times. His story is a rather straightforward one, despite its humble beginnings. Soon as he was able to reliably hold a weapon, Nekaf joined the armies of Cetra, and it wasn't long before his impressive feats of martial skill, loyalty, and strength caught the attention of his superiors. Before his 18th birthday, this ambitious warrior managed to earn himself a position in the esteemed Tomb Guard that marched beneath the personal banner of Cetra the Imperishable. In the 2 years that followed, this foreign-born soldier found himself noticed by none other than the King of Kings himself, who demanded that Nekaf be placed within his personal guard. Now with the Nehekhara focused upon him, Nekaf strove to almost superhuman levels to impress his liege, and show his eternal loyalty. For to him, there was nothing in existence more important than to honor his king. Only a few months passed before it became clear that in all of Cetra's long life and brutal campaigns, never had there been one so dedicated as this young man. Thus, having proven himself incorruptible and reliable beyond any other soul in Nehekhara, Nekaf was promoted to the role of Cetra's personal tomb herald, and gifted with the legendary Flail of Skulls as a gift from his lord, a weapon that had once been wielded by the King of Kings himself. From that point on, the emissary of Cetra served his lord without fail for 40 years. Although he spent much of his time guarding his king, the second most important task that fell to the Herald Nekaf was to ride out and bring the other tomb cities to heel, should they begin to slack in their allegiances. Oftentimes, these disputes would be settled by duels between champions, and thus Nekaf would dismount from his chariot and meet another mighty warrior on the field of battle between two legions. It was during these times that he fought the hardest, as the Herald of Khemri believed maintaining Cetra's honor mattered far more than even his own life. Nekaf never lost one of these challenges, for no opponent could match both his strength and skill. Many clever or swift warriors would think themselves safe when managing to immobilize the Flail of Skulls, only for Nekaf to cave in their skulls with a single ferocious punch. Some renegade kings unleashed men titanic in size and strength, but they would simply look on in horror as the emissary of Setra would casually sidestep their colossal swings and bring the flail of skulls down upon them to tear apart their flesh in a sickening display. Nothing could stop the enforcer of Khemri, and so the king of Nehekhara's rule remained undisturbed for decades. However, even Nekaf's relentless guard and martial prowess could not halt the most ancient enemy of man. Despite having had his life extended far beyond its natural span, Setra could not stave off the clutches of mortality any longer, and death claimed him. The Herald of Khemri had faithfully stood by his liege's side for every agonizing second of those final months, and when it had been confirmed that the king had finally passed, Nekaf was the first to commit suicide so as to follow his lord into the next life. He was mummified with the highest honors and carefully entombed beside the Nehekhara. Thousands of years later, when Setra awoke from death at the call of the Grand Hierophant Katep, he found Nekaf having already awakened and standing by patiently awaiting his lord. Along with the rest of the Hawk legions of Khemri, Nekaf bore personal witness to his king's apoplectic rage as they learned about the schemes of the great betrayer, Nagash. The Herald of Setra marched out at the head of a grand host and led the charge into the undead civil war raging across Nehekhara and even within Khemri itself, crushing all those who did not submit before the King of Kings immediately. After the chaos had been quelled and the Lion of the Desert restored to his throne, the Herald Nekaf was ordered to ride out at the head of immense tomb legions, so that he might remind the other tomb kings just who was in charge in this new age. The emissary of Setra took to this task with his typical zeal, possessed with the same brutal determination and relentless loyalty he was so famed for in life. Every tomb city was visited by the Herald Nekaf, and after carefully reciting the full list of titles of his liege as tradition required, he stated a simple offer: surrender or perish. The wise bent the knee with no hesitation, but no few kings thought themselves beyond the reach of Khemri behind the safety of their walls and skeleton hordes. They were wrong. Each traitor had their armies obliterated, realizing too late that they had made a terrible mistake, and attempting to surrender now that annihilation was rapidly approaching. But the time for mercy had already passed, and they had made their choice. Defiance is met only with death, and at the battle's end, the skull of another conquered king will hang from Nekaf's magical flail. That wraps up the basic lore summary for the Herald Nekaf. If you wish to know his full story with all the nitty-gritty details, I'll have a link to the Setra the Imperishable video up in the top right corner that you can click. With that out of the way, let's move on to how a Tomb Kings player might acquire the Emissary of Setra in campaign. The first and most obvious thing is that anyone who plays Setra the Imperishable should have the Herald Nekaf available right at the start, ready to serve his liege. For other players, I would recommend a quest line that essentially involves one of two storylines. Either it should be a quest line about the player performing a Lich Priest ritual to bind the soul of Nekaf to your lord's service and thus forcing his loyalty, or it should be a quest line about earning the favor of Setra, and therefore he sends Nekaf out to serve you. Perhaps for High Queen Khalida and Grand Hierophant Katep, it's all about pleasing the King of Kings, while for Archon the Black, it's about dominating the soul of Nekaf and enslaving him to your will. That's suitably evil for the Lich King, I think. On to how he would work in battles. The Herald Nekaf is the last character we'll be looking at when it comes to bearing the role of a bodyguard hero. So of course, he should come standard with the Guardian passive, in addition to the usual Tomb King character traits such as Flammable and Nehekhara and Undead. Unlike Tomb Kings and Princes, however, the Heralds are not usually bearing curses. That being said, Total War Warhammer has granted a curse ability to the Lich Priests, which they didn't originally have, so I don't mind if they gave Nekaf some kind of unique curse. That being said, he does have a host of unique abilities, so let's get to that before trying to pull something out of thin air. The first unique ability that the Emissary of Cetra brings to the party is known as the Herald of Despair, which was a very nasty trait that essentially allowed him to make ignoring those fear checks for fighting the undead much more difficult, because, he's spooky. In Total War, this should be a constant passive that simply lowers the leadership of units close enough to our lovely undead champion by a nice, maybe -8, but only if he's in close combat, so make it just like the Blood Roar ability on Griffins. This would synergize extremely well with many facets of the Tomb King Legions without breaking the bank, I think. Next up would be another passive ability called Cetra's Champion, which originally granted Nekaf a host of buffs, so long as he was dueling against another character. I think this should be interpreted into a passive ability that's similar to Grimgor's Best of the Best, so essentially a constant buff that only comes into effect if there's an enemy lord or hero within 30 meters. For Nekaf, it should grant him a small but noticeable ward save in addition to maybe a buff for his melee attack. So perhaps something like an 11% damage resistance buff and plus 10 melee attack. Next up is the skill that all Tomb Heralds bore, known as Sworn Bodyguard. Obviously, we don't have Tomb Heralds in Total War Warhammer, so this ability could be something fun and unique, even though it was technically translated to give Tomb Prince's Guardian, but let's not worry about that. In Tabletop, it essentially allowed the Tomb Heralds to be sworn to a Tomb King or Tomb Prince, and if their charge were wounded, the Herald could essentially step in the way and absorb the damage. So something creative that I would propose is for Sworn Bodyguard to be an active ability that Nekaf could use in battle, which when used would allow him to heal a character in his army, but he takes damage in exchange. Imagine if he could, say, heal the army lord like Cetra or Archon or Khalida for something like 800 to 1000 health, but Nekaf takes that same amount of damage. You'd have to be careful not to overuse it, lest you accidentally end up kind of killing yourself. Perhaps it should maybe only have one use, or could become unusable once Nekaf is below 50% health, so that you don't accidentally suicide. The final ability coming to the party would of course be his magical item, the Flail of Skulls. A big old flail that is made from the gilded skulls of conquered kings, who bite into those that are struck and tear apart their flesh. To best represent this weapon, I would suggest an active buff that when utilized grants Nekaf a major buff to armor piercing and regular weapon strength. When it comes to stat lines, Nekaf should essentially be a slightly improved Tomb Prince, who has a big anti-infantry bonus instead of the anti-large bonus, and doesn't come packed with a shield, obviously. Considering he has that big flail of spooky scary skeletons and then the banner of Cetra in his other hand, I think maybe he should probably have slightly lower armor and melee defense, but in exchange he has higher melee attack and maybe larger damage. Lastly, the Emissary of Cetra had the mount options of a skeletal horse and chariot. Easy peasy. It also should be worth noting that he is a battle standard bearer, which we don't really have right now, though we've talked about many of them in prior Hero of Legend proposals. So maybe if we were to get Nekaf, he could have like some unique version of the rally ability where he could pop an ability that maybe would stop undead from crumbling when it's active that are within 40 meters. So you could have, he could have an ability called like Cetra's like Herald of Cetra or Battle Standard Bearer or something, where when it's activated, it just makes it so that all undead within like 40 meters stop crumbling until that timer goes away. Maybe it could last like 10 seconds or 15 seconds. Just an idea. Anyway, moving on to weaknesses. The major flaw to Nekaf is that honestly, he's not a terribly diverse character, and he'll have an unfortunate amount of overlap with the generic Tomb Prince. This is mainly due to that when Creative Assembly designed the Tomb King's DLC, they seem to have done so with the express intent of never adding the generic Tomb Herald hero, so that they sort of ended up fusing the Tomb Herald and the Tomb Prince together to make a new type of Tomb Prince. This kind of messed with the situation, as in tabletop and the lore, one of the big flaws or downsides of Tomb Kings and Tomb Princes is that they are forbidden from riding regular skeletal steeds, because in Nehekharan culture, horses were considered filthy work beasts of the earth, that no royalty would be caught dead so much as touching. Hence, Tomb Heralds as non-royalty had the major advantage of riding skeletal steeds, which were cheap and highly maneuverable mounts unique to them. Anyway, enough on that particular subject. For the Herald himself, his notable issues would probably be vulnerability to shooting and any type of fire damage. Not having a shield and possessing a hero tier health pool can spell trouble really damn quick, especially with the lack of healing in the Tomb King's roster. Beyond that, I don't think he'd have a terrible amount of concerning issues, but certainly would need to be used with care. Especially as to get his full value, you need to be keeping up with your army's lord, which could get a little difficult if they're on a big, heavy Kimrian war sphinx and Nekaf is just putzing around on a skeletal horse or chariot. Anyway, turning to how he'd function in campaign, let's just skip to the chase in regard to the bodyguard aspect. Like all of the Guardian type heroes we've discussed in prior Heroes of Legend videos, Nekaf should absolutely get the legendary Guardian skill once a high enough level, granting him either a higher physical resistance buff or, well, on his Guardian and passive, or replacing it with just a flat ward save. Beyond that, he should just have a good series of skills available that improve his ability at unleashing colossal amounts of damage when used to proper effectiveness. I could also see him having maybe further debuffs to enemy characters, maybe by allowing you to upgrade his Herald of Despair ability or his Cetra's Champion one. I could also see him having, like, on his unique personal tree, some nice faction-wide buffs to Tomb Guard, as, you know, he is a Tomb Herald is basically just the highest possible rank someone who went through the echelons of Tomb Guard can get to. So it would make sense that having him in your army would maybe allow him to either kind of help restore the Tomb Guard to the effectiveness they had in life, or some yada yada nonsense. And then, of course, the last thing is that as a Battle Standard Bearer character, I would definitely expect him to maybe have some unique skills or abilities that allow him to, like, just buff the leadership of his army, either just faction, or not faction-wide, but army-wide leadership buffs, or just a bunch of really interesting, unique abilities. I would just really want them to go wild with it. One of the things we just don't really have right now in Total War Warhammer are Battle Standard Bearers, which sucks. I mean, I would very much like to see them become a much more regular thing and just kind of show up all over the place. But, you know, it would be great at least to see it show up with these special characters. Anyway, that's enough on that. Finally, when it comes to appearance, the Herald Nekaf is one of those classic characters who sadly never received an official tabletop model. However, he does have this one little piece of art from the end times, so he does technically have something. That being said, it's just a portrait of his head, so I'd be interested to see how Creative Assembly would design the rest of his body. The Flail of Skulls actually sounds quite cool, as the idea of wielding a weapon comprised of the golden skulls of conquered kings that chatter and bite at those who come too close sounds just delightful. Also, we'd finally have a character wielding a banner. Granted, it's a Tomb King banner, so not fluttering in the wind all pretty-like, but more of a brutal display of rigid gold, but hey, progress. Moving on, as I'm sure you've been able to tell by now, the Herald Nekaf is the ultimate embodiment of Nehekharan loyalty and a paragon of the virtues held by his people. Yet, there is another soul we will be examining, one who is the exact opposite to Nekaf in every way. On one hand, we have a fiercely loyal foreign-born peasant who rose through the ranks thanks to his valor to achieve a life full of glory. On the other hand, we have a treacherous noble-born son who in his envious desire for power murdered those who loved him and suffered a brutal death and eternal suffering as his reward. Who am I speaking of? Oh, I'm sure you've heard of him. A horrific desert wraith who is comprised from a swarm of scarabs. In life, he was known as Prince Apophis, the traitor prince of Numis. Almost 3,000 years ago, Prince Apophis was one of the many sons born to the king of Numis. Yet despite this divine privilege, he was filled with envy, for it was not his destiny to inherit the throne, as the laws of succession within Nehekhara are incredibly strict. So, one fateful night, Apophis took up a curved dagger and slit the throats of his entire family, thus ending the royal line of Numis and declared himself king. This enraged the population, and a full-on rebellion broke out. Those who had been loyal to the murdered king breaking into the throne room and dragging the usurper to the temples so that he might be judged. There is no crime in Nehekhara considered more terrible than regicide, and it was punished harshly. Normally, those who attempted to seize the throne would be denied the privilege of mummification, and their bones cast out into the desert to be fed upon by carrion. This ensured that they would be forever denied access to the lands of the honored dead, cursed to either wander the torturous depths of the Nehekharan underworld, or, in the worst case, consigned to utter oblivion. However, the crimes of Apophis were far more severe, and his punishment was altered to fit the crime. The priests had the murderous prince bound, and entombed him alive within a sarcophagus filled with flesh-eating scarabs. It is recorded that his agonized death screams could be heard through the temple walls and out in the streets of Numis itself. Mysteriously, when the lid was opened, the beetles had all vanished, and all that remained within was a skull picked clean of flesh. To complete his punishment, a single magical hieroglyph was carved into the skull of Apophis, to curse the soul of the prince for all eternity. Finally, the skull was thrown into the deep desert, to never receive a proper burial. Upon his death, Apophis' soul was claimed by Osirian, the god of the underworld, to be tortured for all eternity for his crimes. However, being of noble birth, Apophis had the right to strike a bargain with Osirian, and asked that in exchange for his release, he would claim a soul to stand in for his own. A perfect match that would suffer his judgment in his stead. Osirian agreed, and thus the cursed Scarab Lord was born. The Prince of Numis returned to the mortal plane as a swarm of beetles that rises up from the ground to reveal a shadowy figure in their midst. Upon this mass of insects that comprises the desert revenant sits the skull of Apophis, looking upon the world in search of his next prey. In his hand is the very same blade that he used to slit the throats of his kin, still dripping with their blood thousands of years later. The cursed Scarab Lord roams endlessly in hopes of finding a worthy soul equal to his own, for only by slaying them with his curved dagger can he claim them. However, while this bleeding blade may be the tool used for the final stroke, it is not the true threat of Apophis. Instead, it is the swarm of flesh-eating scarabs that make up the desert revenant's body. Nothing can stop the Prince of Numis, as the beetles making up his body can easily crawl through the smallest of gaps in walls to suddenly form the horrific visage of Prince Apophis within. He has the maneuverability of the insects that comprise him, his body able to burst apart, flying across the battlefield in a matter of seconds, and reforming to loom over his desired kill. These are powers of mere convenience, however, as when Apophis enters the fray, it is then that his true horror is revealed. Should his foe attempt to hide behind lines of soldiers, the prince can open his jaws horrifically wide and vomit out a tide of scarabs to sweep aside those standing in his way. Worse still, harming Prince Apophis is virtually impossible, as new beetles simply fill in any damage caused to his body. Almost nothing can stop him once his sights are set upon a soul, the desert revenant relentless in his pursuit until his quarry lays slain. Many great heroes and terrible warlords have met their deaths thanks to the cursed Scarab Lord. Most notably Duke Cheldric of Brionne after his victory over the infamous Sultan Jafar of Araby, and Graf Himholtz, the Templar Grand Master of the Knights of the Blazing Sun, after the legendary warrior slew King Farak in a great battle outside Numus. Each soul claimed by Apophis is bound within a cage, a soul cage, and taken down to the Nehekharan underworld, so that they may be weighed on Usirian's scale to see if their soul is equal to the prince's own. However, the truth is that no two souls will ever be equal, and thus the scale is always unbalanced. Prince Apophis will never understand that he has doomed himself to roam the earth for all eternity, forever believing in a hope that will never be realized. That concludes the lore summary for the cursed Scarab Lord. So now the time has come to discuss how he might be acquired in campaign. I think the best way to earn him would be some kind of simple quest where you perhaps have to wound or assassinate a certain number of characters to draw him out, or maybe complete a short storyline about earning his service. Nothing too complicated, that way you could acquire him nice and early. Moving on to how he would work in battle, thankfully, Prince Apophis is a rather straightforward character compared to many of the heroes we've talked about in this series, as he has a very unique design. Starting with his potential stat line, I think he would essentially be slightly worse in all aspects than a Tomb Prince, with the exception that his health pool should be notably larger, and he doesn't have any sort of anti-large or anti-infantry. The main reason for this is that in exchange, Prince Apophis gains regeneration, terror, and strider, and he also doesn't have the flammability debuff, or the weakness to fire, outside of his regeneration, of course. I would also think that he might be designed with a slight amount of physical resistance to better represent his nature as a desert revenant, but that's very optional, and he wasn't ethereal or anything in tabletop. He does come with the Nehekharan Undead rule, so there's a small amount of additional healing from the Realm of Souls mechanic. Nothing crazy, but it's worth mentioning. Moving on now to his unique powers. The first is, of course, his famous ability known as simply Scarab Prince, which is that he has the signature move of vomiting a bunch of beetles all over people. This is technically meant to be represented as him more knocking a bunch of people out of the way, not so much like he vomits on you and you just die horribly as you get eaten alive. The scarabs can kill you, but they're not armor piercing. It was a very low strength attack, so it struggled to really deal much damage. It was more for disruption or to try and sneak in a little bit of damage on somebody. I would say Scarab Lord should be an active ability that causes a breath template of beetles to be cast with the goal of disrupting enemy troops. So kind of like Wind Blast, but instead of dealing much in the way of damage, it's more just like knock people over and get them out of the way. If it did not do much or any damage, I would have it be able to be used an infinite number of times with a decent cooldown timer. But on the other hand, you could just make it a traditional breath attack like the ones used by Throg and the River Troll Hag, where it can be used like 3 times and it really hurts when it hits you. I think either would be fair interpretations. Furthermore, Scarab Prince actually does have a secondary effect, where when the Cursed Scarab Prince dies, his beetles basically kind of go in every direction, attacking anyone around as he disperses. So I would say give him the Death Blow trait that like Slayers have, and when he dies, just let him blow up to harm enemies in a big old bug swarm when he goes down. Next up is his Soul Reaper ability, which represents the soul that it represents Apophis basically zeroing in on the individual he seeks to capture for the underworld, and he kind of like goes ham on that individual. This should be interpreted as an active ability that will pin an enemy in place, an enemy lord or hero, so characters only, and slap them with a bunch of debuffs. I'd say a big reduction in armor and melee defense would be appropriate. Though perhaps it should instead lock them in place, but buff Prince Apophis, like massively increase his melee attack and damage. That way it technically represents only him landing the killing blow. Either way works, I imagine. I do know many people in the community tend to dislike abilities that lower defensive abilities as opposed to buffing offensive abilities, because you know it doesn't really work as well if Apophis is like, I have to kill this man, and so he lowers their stats only for like a Tomb Scorpion or Ushabti or Cetra to come out of left field and just like snipe them because, you know, all their defenses are down. You want it to be something that encourages Apophis to get in there and get his hands dirty. Beyond that, I would actually really like to see Prince Apophis get his dagger or even his magically engraved skull be upgraded to essentially be magic items. Because in tabletop, the Prince of Numas didn't actually come with any magic items, which I always found kind of crazy and strange, considering he has that spooky, forever bleeding blade in his hand that just screams, hey, I'm a magic item that does something cool. So maybe you could upgrade his dagger to be an item and call it something like the Cursed Blade of Numas that grants an active ability to give Apophis major armor-piercing damage for a limited time. Or maybe it gives him a temporary buff where if he hits you, he inflicts damage over time, like a bleed effect. I don't know. Those are just some ideas. Next up, we have the weaknesses section, which is once again pretty straightforward for the Cursed Scarab Lord. As a regenerating character, he must be extremely wary of fire damage, especially since he doesn't have any notable magic or physical resistances like Morgr does, for instance. He likely would be quite swift at least, so hopefully that would allow Apophis to have some decent dodging options, because seeing as he had essentially the ability to fly, you imagine he would be quite quick. But he'd also really struggle against elite units and monsters. If based on how I imagine Apophis, you would not want him fighting like a big old block of great swords or chaos warriors or any of that stuff, or monsters, because his stat line wouldn't really be good for him to just be in sustained combat. He seems to me much more like a character you want kind of hovering around the edges looking for an opportunity to get in there and snipe out a character, or because he causes terror, you can kind of have him as a cheaper terror bomb without having to bring a full monster. But at least the Prince of Numas would have the ability, if he did get kind of in a bad scrap, he could fall back and regenerate for a little bit. Let's move on to Prince Apophis's functionality and campaign. Starting with his agent actions, obviously he is a very frightening assassin-type character, and should be represented as such through his abilities and agent actions, but maybe with some twists. I would say for actual agent actions, I would give him Scavenge, Cleanse Corruption, Damage Walls, Block Army, and of course Assassinate. But definitely a unique blue skill that he should bring to the party is the ability to assassinate lords. Perhaps this could be a skill that he's only able to unlock around level 10, that way he, needs to earn it. But I would give it a flat-out 100% success rate, but he can only use it once every 20 turns, And if used on a immortal or legendary character, obviously they'd only be wounded instead of flat out killed. Then maybe at, say, level 20, you could put another point into the Assassinate Lord skill, and it reduces the cooldown from 20 turns to 15 turns. And then maybe at level 30, there could be another point he could put in there that would be the last stage where he could reduce the cooldown to 10 turns. Just, something like that. Another thing I could see for Apophis in campaign would be a later skill called Soul Cage that works very similar to the one used by Eltharian's faction. So maybe, say, at level 15 or 20, he unlocks the ability to have a one use per battle ability that is an active where you would lock an enemy lord or hero into a prison. But maybe they have to be below 20% health for it to be able to target them. And if you click it on somebody, it deals pretty good Spirit Leech type damage and pins them in place. Beyond that, for his starting trait in campaign, I would give Apophis one called Desert Revenant, which should make it so that if he's wounded or, dies in battle, the Cursed Scarab Lord will always return the next turn. So he'd be like Vlad once Vlad gets his ring. If he dies, not a big deal, he'll immediately pop back up next turn. I would also like to see him have at least one skill that notably reduces enemy leadership when in the same region as the Prince of Numas. Because, if I had to fight, or if anything had to fight a creature that is functionally unkillable, and their body is just made of a mass swarm of horrifying bugs, and then there's just a skull on top and it can vomit them at you, no thank you. No thank you. That's nightmare fuel. I would not want to fight that. Lastly, he should of course have a lovely unique character skill tree that just greatly augments his ability to just absolutely destroy enemy characters. Finally, when it comes to appearance, there's an extremely easy thing here that in reality is absurdly hard. Prince Apophis is blessed with some just gorgeous artwork and an excellent tabletop model. But as we all know by now, his body is literally made up of a swarm of damn scarabs that are always moving. Creative Assembly themselves have expressed they deeply want to do Apophis, but he would be a very unique and therefore expensive character to make. That's actually, honestly, the reason I even started the Heroes of Legend DLC proposal series in the first place. To suggest the idea of getting smaller but more focused DLCs that instead of giving an absolute ton of content that, is $20 and it gives you a bunch of stuff, but it's kind of broad, to instead give us maybe smaller DLCs that are more like little packs that are maybe $5 to $8 that are focused on just a handful of more difficult to develop characters, like our Bug Boy here. In any event, I can see Khemri just over the next dune. I hope you all managed to survive this horrible desert heat and didn't make the obvious mistake of looking into the eyes of our sepulchral stalker guides. Oh dear. I really should have mentioned that earlier now that I think about it. Nobody accidentally met their gaze and turned into pillars of sand, right? Right? Hey, look over there! I can actually see the marble Great Pyramid of Cetra from here. Isn't that cool? Let's go ahead and head into the Tomb City, rest up a bit, I can say hi to Cetra, and then we'll sail out of the fleet port of terror, old Xandri over there on the coast, and get back home. I'm sure nothing could possibly go wrong on the last leg of our journey. Thanks for watching, guys. See you next time. Bye.